Good afternoon. This is the second day of the APS Virtual Symposium, Evidence, the Use and Abuse of Data. I'm glad that so many of you are able to join us today. This is the second panel of our conference. It's entitled, How Do We Know? Reading Evidence in the 18th Century. My name is Kyle Roberts, and I'm the Associate Director of Library and Museum Programming at the American Philosophical Society. For those of you joining us for the first time, the American Philosophical Society was founded by Benjamin Franklin in 1743. The society has long been a catalyst for the discovery of new knowledge. Election to membership honors those who have made exceptionally significant contributions to science, the arts and humanities, and public life. The society promotes research by providing over $1 million in research grants a year, primarily to younger scholars who need the support the most. Our library and museum collections and research centers serve scholars and visitors from across the globe. We've gone virtual because the pandemic has shut us down, but we find that this actually enables us to reach much broader audiences. So again, we're glad you're here. Given the many ways that our founder, Benjamin Franklin, used evidence and information in his scientific research, publishing, and diplomatic work, we felt that this week's conference on the use and abuse of data in the past, present, and in looking into the future would be particularly fitting. Let me just offer a few words about the format of what you're going to see over the next hour or so. Each speaker is going to talk for about 8 to 10 minutes about their work. There are pre-circulated papers available on the conference website, and we'll put the link to that in the password in the chat box. We encourage you to, if you haven't already had a chance to read the papers, to download them and peruse them. The speakers, as I said, are giving kind of a shortened version of those papers. We are going to use Zoom's Q&A feature, which if you look on your navigation bar at the very bottom of your screen, it says Q&A, it should be right down there. We want you to go ahead and type in all the questions that you have and submit them to us. We're going to leave 20, 25 minutes for conversation with the audience. You can ask a question at any point in time. So, put those questions in as they come to you. For the questions that we don't get a chance to answer, we will try to provide some answers, if we can, after the conference. We also encourage you to keep the dialogue going, right? We're going to have, an hour or so here, but use social media as a way to reflect on the things that you're seeing in and hearing in today's conference. The conference hashtag, as you can see on the screen, is APS Evidence, and we can be found on Twitter and on Instagram and Facebook. We also have a website, which we encourage you. This is also being recorded, so if you find that this was a particularly great experience for you and you want to share it with your friends, please check back probably next week and we'll have the video up on our YouTube channel. Our commentator today for this panel is Joyce Chaplin, the James Duncan Phillips Professor of Early American History in the Department of History at Harvard University. At Harvard, she teaches the histories of science, climate, colonialism, and the environment. She is an award-winning author of many books, including works on the South, on Benjamin Franklin, on Thomas Malthus, and she is currently working on a history of resource conservation, climate change, and settler colonialism. We're especially proud that she was able to join us today because she was elected this past spring as a member of the American Philosophical Society. So thank you for being with us today, and I'm now going to turn this over to Joyce.
Thank you so much, Kyle. And I'm very grateful to the APS for organizing this event, the conference, and for inviting me to participate in it. I'm very sorry I was unable to attend the opening session, so I don't know what was already said there. But here's how I'd like to open this panel. I begin with a land acknowledgement. I'm joining you from Cambridge, Massachusetts, the ancestral land of the Massachusetts people. I acknowledge their historic and continuing presence here. I also want to say Black Lives Matter. I'll start now by introducing all of the speakers in the order in which they will give brief presentations to accompany their pre-circulated papers. So beginning with Gordon Fraser, who is a lecturer and presidential fellow in American Studies at the University of Manchester. He is the author of Star Territory, Printing the Universe in 19th Century America, forthcoming from the University of Pennsylvania Press, and his scholarship has appeared in PMLA and American Quarterly, among other journals. The essay that he will talk about today is drawn from a new book project provisionally titled Reading Against Enlightenment. Our second speaker will be Elise Mitchell, who is a PhD candidate in Atlantic World History and Caribbean and Latin American History at New York University. Her current project, on which she'll speak today, is Smallpox and Slavery, Morbidity, Medical Intervention, and Enslaved People's Lives in the Greater Caribbean, which examines the ways that smallpox quarantines, treatments, and inoculations affected enslaved Africans during the 17th and 18th centuries. Ms. Mitchell is the recipient of fellowships from the McNeil Center for Early American Studies, the Social Science Research Council, the Ford Foundation, the Huntington Library, and NYU. Her essays on the history of slavery, gender, medicine, and public health have appeared in The Atlantic, Black Perspectives, and a forthcoming volume, Medicine and Healing in the Age of Slavery. And our third speaker will be Jutta Schickore, who is Ruth Hall's Professor of History and Philosophy of Science and Medicine at Indiana University. Her work has been supported by the Wellcome Trust, the Dibner Institute for the History of Science and Technology at MIT, the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science in Berlin, the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton, and the National Humanities Center. Her many books and articles include, most recently, just to mention one, the monograph about method, experimenters, snake venom, and the history of writing scientifically, which was published by the University of Chicago in 2017. So we will begin first with Gordon Fraser's presentation.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you especially to Adriana Link and Kyle Roberts for making all of the logistics of these presentations possible. I'm going to talk today for about 9 minutes. And as I talk, if we could, to begin, if we could actually go to the second slide of my slide presentation, which is blank, that'll let me start talking. So for the past few months, I have been studying the history of reading in the early United States Republic, a project that emerged from my concern about the limitations of fact and evidence for fostering a culture of self-governance. Since 2016, many experts in the humanities have positioned themselves as fact-checkers to the powerful. The literary scholar Sam Fallon described this in the pages of the Chronicle of Higher Education as an example of what he calls the pedantic professor. President Donald Trump claims that he will take medieval action against economic migrants, and professors are left sputtering about his misuse of the word medieval, pointing out that the period now known as late antiquity was less violent and featured more freedom of movement than previously supposed. And they're correct, but in some fundamental way, they seem to miss the point. That said, I sympathize. I'm a little bit baffled about how humanists might otherwise foster democratic practices when faced with a fire hose of mendacity and cruelty. And behind all this fact-checking, I think, is a hope that we could replay Senator Howard Baker's famous question amid the Watergate hearings in 1973. What did the president know, and when did he know it? Establishing the facts of President Richard Nixon's behavior was essential to removing him from office. And yet, during the early Republican period of the United States, which historians usually describe as ranging from 1787 to 1828, numerous theorists of republicanism imagined another bulwark of self-governance, not fact, narrative. Narratives, biography, history, in some cases novels, would train people for self-governance in various ways. And these theorists varied in their views of fiction, but regardless of how they came down on the question of novels, many imagined that reading narratives would enable a society of self-governing individuals to thrive. Now, there were, broadly speaking, two overlapping theories about how reading stories trained people for self-governance. And these are quite simplifications, so I'll be happy to talk more about them in the Q&A. And the first theory I'm going to describe is quite pragmatic and the second utopian. If we could go to the next slide. The pragmatic theory, which I'll call the John Adams theory, went something like this. In a self-governing society, people share power. And in sharing power with fellow citizens, you need to be able to read those fellow citizens, to understand them not merely as fulfilling a narrow social role, but to understand them as dynamic individuals with loves, hatreds, desires, and aims that might not only diverge from your own, but might confound and contradict one another. You need to understand their character, or we might put it differently today, suggesting that you need a sophisticated theory of mind. But either way you put it, you'll find that evidence and fact are insufficient to this task. One will never understand the inner life of a future Napoleon on the basis of fact alone. Biographers and novelists will fill in the blanks based on plausible suppositions, and we will learn to read the behaviors of future demagogues and tyrants by reading stories about them. The second theory, and I'll call it, for the sake of making things simple for the short discussion, I'll call it the Charles Brockden Brown theory after the early American novelist. This theory went something like this. Stories provide examples rather than precepts. And in a society of shared governance, people need to be trained by example if they are to become virtuous. These defenders of narratives hoped that such narratives would foster associative bonds of virtue and sentiment. And hoping to foster these distinct values, Charles Brockden Brown and others hoped that readers would be united by the shared experience of witnessing the virtuous navigate a complex and unvirtuous world. The problem with this theory, of course, is its contingency. Novels that exemplify virtue have to be written and read, and other novels have to be eliminated or ignored. And if we could go to the next slide. Armed with these two theories of reading from the early Republic, I thought that I would try to examine reading as it took place on the ground. And my methods have been mixed. I've examined extant records from circulating libraries. I've examined some marginalia. I've looked at commonplace books, which were often records of an individual's reading habits. And I've also examined plagiarism and quotation, which indicates not only what people read, but also what people thought was compelling enough to reuse. And my conclusions are, quite frankly, at this point, pretty messy. I dismiss the radical Enlightenment theory of reading as inculcating virtue, not because it's impossible, but because the actual landscape of reading practices in the late 18th and early 19th century was simply too varied to produce a unified outcome. But the first, more modest and pragmatic theory of reading, the John Adams theory, as I called it, might have something to it. Reading stories just might train us to be skeptical readers of other people, although, as I'll talk about, I wonder about the implications of training people in this kind of skepticism. So to begin, consider Elizabeth Phillips Payson, one of the two readers I discuss in the pre-circulated paper. And if we could go to the next slide. Payson read voraciously and widely, and she was a shrewd and canny reader of character. You can see here 4 pages of reflection that she wrote after reading a biography of Catherine the Great. And Payson was initially in her reflection, full of admiration for a woman who made clear that women can exercise power with foresight and knowledge. And yet, over the course of her reflection on Catherine, Payson becomes disillusioned. She notes that Catherine was very capricious in her choice of advisors, that she would hire one advisor and then dismiss them on a whim and replace them with someone who was a, quote, greater admirer of her charms, unquote. She was vain, fickle, and feckless, as are all tyrants, Payson concluded. And so in reading and reflecting, Payson went from admiration to condemnation. And if we could go to the next slide. And Payson approached her own uncertainty with restraint, even leaving blank spaces in her commonplace book when she was unsure about her facts, things she wanted to fill in later. And I discussed this in the pre-circulated essay. You can see here one of those blank spaces in her discussion of The Coquette, a 1797 novel very loosely based on a true story. Payson tried to decode the story, and when she didn't know the real name of a participant, she left a blank space to be filled in later, as you can see circled in red. And so in some sense, Payson seems to emblematize this model, and yet Payson is only one reader. And so I'd like to consider a less restrained and perhaps less admirable reader, William Brown, a Hartford attorney who has no connection with Charles Brockden Brown, and who in 1799 predicted that French soldiers and enslaved Black men in the United States would unite in revolution. And here, and if we could go to the next slide, here is Brown's prediction, and I'll read it. Quote, "Imagination already conceives myriads of furious Africans collecting together the materials of vengeance and marching in dread array to the dwellings of their masters. Paint to yourselves cities given up to indiscriminate plunder, villages sacked and burned, the country desolated, and the fields watered with the blood of their cultivators. Listen to the groans of wretched white men, butchered by their infuriate slaves, the shrieks of mothers and of virgins, a prey to more than demoniac lust and barbarity, and the cries of infants stabbed at the breast or reeking on the points of sportive javelins." Unquote. The language is gratuitous. It is also, and I think this is important, it is also copied from Brown's reading. And if we could go to the next slide. He copies a translation of Cicero's oration against Catiline, the shrieks of mothers, the flight of children, and the violation of the Vestal Virgins, an essay in the British Mercury about the French invasion of Switzerland, overflowed with the blood of their cultivators, the Bible, materials of vengeance, and an 18th century play, Gustavus Vassa, stabbed at the breast or reeking on the points of sportive javelins. William Brown finds in his reading gratuitous scenes of violence that help him to express what he imagines to be the political aims of others. His predictions are lurid and wrong, but they emblematize a long history of fetishizing Black men's sexuality as a means of justifying violence against Black people. Brown had lived through a revolution, but the imagery he drew upon to describe revolutionary violence was adapted from Cicero, Henry Brooke, and the Bible, not from experience and not from observation. Through reading, he understands, mistakenly, the intentions of others. And if we could go to the next slide. To conclude, Payson's sophistication as a reader did not make her immune to making incorrect assumptions. She was mistaken in several ways about the Coquette, a more highly fictionalized story than Payson realized. And William Brown was worse, a wide-ranging, eclectic reader whose education led him to lurid conclusions. And yet, while readers were only imperfectly able to distinguish between the fictional and the fraudulent, literature nonetheless provided them with a language to express their intuitions about the aims and motivations of others. Narratives did not enable the virtuous interconnection between individuals, at least not reliably. But narratives certainly did enable people to think with varying degrees of sophistication about the aims and desires of others, if sometimes mistakenly. My conclusions thus far are indeed modest, and my hope is that our conversation here will advance my thinking and all of our thinking, I suppose, about narratives and political judgment. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having me. So to begin, I would like to repeat the story that I tell, or parts of the story that I tell in the larger paper. If we could go to the next slide, please. Okay. So in May 1737, an enslaved African woman gave birth to a, quote, mulatto boy, while she and her shipmates observed a quarantine near La Guaira at the Isla de Aves Grande. She gave birth in the unforgiving heat, while smallpox, dysentery, and other fevers spread among her shipmates, all men, women, and children who boarded the Elizabeth in Barbados. The South Sea Company designed their perilous crossing from Barbados to La Guaira along a treacherous Eastern Caribbean route to fulfill the terms of their Asiento contract. One enslaved man was deserted at the Isla La Tortuga because Benjamin Deuce, the captain of the Elizabeth, feared that he would spread smallpox to the others. Can we go to the next slide? However, when the enslaved arrived at La Guaira on March 11th, Spanish officials reported that they were already infected with smallpox and ordered the ship to Cabo Blanco and then to the uninhabited island Isla de Aves Grande for a quarantine. The Africans struggled to survive smallpox in tents on this tiny desert island for nearly 4 months. 23 enslaved Africans died during the quarantine, and the survivors languished in limbo until a protomedicato summoned from Panama City inspected them and certified that they did not have any contagious diseases such as the plague, smallpox, or any other internal or external epidemic illness that could result in an infection in the future. In July, the enslaved woman and her newborn son, as well as her 235 surviving shipmates, returned to La Guaira to be sold to Caraqueño enslavers. Their sale culminated nearly a year of a variety of grueling seaborne journeys, punctuated by intervals of disquieting stasis and unpredictable cycles of illness, violence, and separation. This story is but one chapter in the long history of maritime quarantine and the intra-American slave trade. So the essay that I provide is a micro-historical account of this one enslaved woman's Eastern Caribbean journey. And I use it to think through the production of archives, history, and aggregated data about the intra-American slave trade. This voyage has received passing mention in the literature on the British Asiento trade. Historians have previously relied on either the Spanish or British records of this voyage. However, this enslaved woman and her shipmates slipped through the archive's cracks into miscellany. You find them in pages scrawled and scrapped and scattered across the world, and their stories bleed across borders in ways that elude historical inquiries that are circumscribed by the boundaries of European empires and their respective archives. This dispersal is but one of the afterlives of the exhausting itinerancy that these enslaved people endured as Europeans shuffled them across the Atlantic and back and forth to Caribbean markets and quarantines. Attending to the human history of the Elizabeth's voyage requires methodological pivots that are at once archivally dexterous, epistemological reorientation, and undisciplined speculations that match both the chaos and the precision of the violence represented in and by slavery's archives. The enslaved women's intra-Caribbean crossings on board the Elizabeth challenge and transform our understandings of the intra-Caribbean slave trade's geographic scope and scale. Historians have tended to base their conclusions about the structure, experience, and implications of the South Sea Company's Asiento trade almost exclusively on the trade out of Jamaica, where enslaved men were shuttled to wealthier Spanish-American ports in large numbers. The enslaved Africans trafficked through Jamaica endured one highly centralized branch of the trade. However, their experiences leave us with unanswered questions about enslaved women's and children's journeys. Historians Pedro Welch, Rafael Dionyso Agnes, and Alex Barucki have examined the structure of the licit and illicit Eastern Caribbean trade, identifying Barbados and Curacao as key transit points. Their studies emphasize the importance of commercial regulations and geography, but overlook the cultural influences that produced gendered slave trading patterns in Barbados. In the larger paper, I discuss the demographic significance of enslaved women and the slave trade through Barbados and rethink the period before transshipment, known as refreshment, through a gendered lens. I argue that enslaved women who were trafficked through Bridgetown were particularly vulnerable to sexual violence at the hands of white men because of the broader culture of sexual violence in Bridgetown and the culture of violence aboard slave ships and within the trade. And I also speculate about the fact that she may have conceived her son within that context. And we can talk about that at further length in Q&A if people would like to. So now, enslaved Africans typically endured licensed and unlicensed voyages from Bridgetown to La Guaira on small vessels, which carried anywhere from less than a dozen to upwards of 250 people. In the 1720s and 1730s, some African women found themselves aboard ships with equal proportions of men and boys and women and girls. These enslaved people were almost always described as sickly or refuse when they arrived in La Guaira. They frequently endured quarantines that lasted anywhere from a couple of weeks to months along the windward South American coast. These quarantines added additional journeys through Caribbean land and waterscapes, which challenge linear conceptualizations of the intra-American slave trade. The quantitative and aggregative methodologies that historians have previously applied to think through the intra-Caribbean slave trade obscure some of these chaotic crossings, and as well as their disquieting periods of stasis in the region's small island and coastal geography. So by reorienting the history of these voyages around the lives of the enslaved rather than the life of the trade, doing that work has purchased beyond just the ethical imperatives of historical redress. Social and cultural analyses of the intra-American slaving practices are crucial for any attempt to aggregate veritable data about the scope and scale of the trade itself. However, historians of the intra-American slave trade have tended to prioritize these aggregative methodologies that echo some of the commercial numeracy of the slave trading companies. These methods not only fail to produce histories that are, in the words of Stephanie Smallwood, quote, accountable to the enslaved, but they also produce ahistorical accounts that skew the aggregative data about the trade. Can we move to the next slide, please? So this is a screenshot of the recently released Inter-American Slave Trade Database, which contains two irreconcilable entries for the voyage of the Elizabeth. One incorrectly states that the Elizabeth arrived in La Guaira on February 1737. We can move to the next slide, please. And would you mind pressing play? If it can play, good, okay. Which says that they arrived in February of 1737, and the other states that they arrived in July of 1737. Both entries contain discrepancies about the number of enslaved Africans on board. We can move to the next slide, please. And these errors echo the contrasting archival and historiographical accounts of the voyage, as well as the fact that the enslaved woman gave birth to a baby boy and managed to keep him alive through the quarantine. I say that these entries are irreconcilable because the Elizabeth arrived in La Guaira twice, in March and in July. And now the database itself is a collaborative project, and I considered contacting the creators about this error, but I wasn't sure how to frame my concern because it's a difficult error to resolve because it points to a broader structural issue with the database. The current structure of the database, and you can press play, please. If you can see in the slide, is not capable of representing the quarantine or the cyclical nature of this voyage because it, quote, emulates the format and methodology of its predecessor, the transatlantic slave trade database. The decision to replicate the already fraught approach to the evident in the transatlantic slave trade database retransmutes enslaved Africans' data in a way that occludes human experiences like disease and childbirth, which profoundly shape the voyages and their outcomes, particularly in the case of the intra-American trade. Similarly, the scholarship about the intra-American slave trade presumes that all voyages were linear and final, implying that intervals of quarantine were ultimately inconsequential, perilous delays. In my larger project, I found examples of enslaved people who were re-embarked and returned to their origin port after a quarantine. So the linear framing collapses the otherwise normative chaos of enslaved people's peripatetic journeys and the human histories and lives that unfolded in the process. While I strongly believe that this database is already an extremely useful pedagogical tool, its current structural limitations obscure the nature of these voyages and impede our ability to fully grasp the geographic scope and the demographic scale of the trade. Some of the database's creators have asserted elsewhere that aggregating this data ought to drive cultural and social histories of the slave trade. However, I'm concerned that this presupposition reveals a broader emerging methodological hierarchy within our field, in which big data, regardless of its historicity, is privileged over textured qualitative accounts. And we see this play out both in the discipline as well as in our institutions and the level of institutional support and funding they're willing to commit to other forms of projects. And so can we move to the next slide, please? Okay, so just to conclude briefly, in light of the COVID-19 crises, and I think attending to the intersecting social histories of public health, race, gender violence, and reproduction within the intra-American slave trade is incredibly important. The artist who created the image that you see there, her name is De La Roca. She's a graffiti and tattoo artist of Afro-Venezuelan descent who was moving between Colombia and Venezuela at the time that she made this image. As a result of the ongoing humanitarian crisis there, the COVID-19 pandemic has compounded the crisis in the region, resulting in border closings, shortages of medical supplies, food and water, and new, more restrictive laws that confine people's movement in the region. So I think as historians are thinking forward about what kinds of methodologies and approaches we'll need in order to think through the history of our current pandemic, as well as the histories that sort of led up to it, thinking about reconsidering the sort of gender geography as well as the social and cultural histories that add texture and help our understanding of human life within the context of the slave trade might be more imperative. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the APS and to Carl and Adriana for organizing this and for including me in this conference and for all the stimulating contributions so far. In my paper, I present the outline of a rather curious endeavor, the investigations of blue milk. Several late 18th century journals and magazines reported that fresh milk sometimes develops blue spots and eventually turns completely blue. Blue milk tastes bad. It cannot easily be turned into butter or cream. People who consume this milk might get sick, as would animals. Many farmers suffered significant loss of income because of it. But what was it? And what could be done about it? In my paper, I describe how farmers, naturalists, veterinarians, public health officials, anatomists and physiologists, and even parish priests tried to solve that puzzle. They suggested possible causes and means to prevent milk from turning blue. Was it a cow disease? Had the cows eaten something bad? Maybe something blue, like a blue plant? Were the stables of dairies dirty? Were the cows perhaps bewitched? Academic and non-academic journals reported successful treatments and also unsuccessful attempts to prevent blue coloration. They were changing foods, they were changing the grazing land, cleaning, giving the cows medicines, and all kinds of other things. The problem continued to puzzle inquirers until the 20th century. It was never really solved. It went away as increased attention was paid to hygiene and sanitation on dairy farms. I'm particularly interested in the strategies and approaches that the investigators used to understand this phenomenon. So the study is part of a larger project on the history of experimental strategies. And you can please skip the next slide. Okay, next slide, please. So when I read the keynote paper by Professors Schifrin, Stigler, and Jameson yesterday and heard the discussion, I was struck by how much my essay resonated with theirs. In the next few minutes, I want to highlight these connections. So in their paper, they note various things, like they note that human bias structures the assessment of evidence. They point out the evaluation of evidence, that in the evaluation of evidence, numerous possible factors and sources of error must be taken into account. Remember the example of forgery that Rich Schifrin presented. They point out that research methodologies are designed for normal science, not for new discoveries. They note that how we identify experts varies from field to field. And they highlight the significance that is now attached to replication. I agree with all of these statements, but in my paper, I asked, or in my larger work as well, I asked an additional question, namely, how did our ideas and practices related to evidence, methods, and expertise come into being? And how have they changed over time? And several findings from my study on blue milk and other related research that I've done speak to the points raised by Schifrin, Stigler, and Jameson. Next slide, please. So the 18th century problem of blue milk strikingly exemplifies this challenge of the truly novel. 18th century researchers on blue milk, for 18th century research on blue milk is not normal science. There was no precedent for such experiments. There was no error repertoire that was in place. The episode of blue milk helps us appreciate how very difficult it is to deal with a truly novel situation, and how challenging it is to set up an error repertoire in experimental science. We can also unpack the notion that human bias affects the collection of evidence. In the case of blue milk, we see that everyday assumptions, theoretical expectations, programmatic larger frameworks, technical possibilities, and technical limitations structured the search for causes and treatments. And methodological ideas did too. So for example, explanations of blue milk in terms of witchcraft were not considered to be an option by most of the people who published on this problem. Next slide, please. The other thing that we can see is that methodological ideals change over time. And because the problem of blue milk was so persistent, it generates explicit methodological discussions. The inquirer's methodological ideals changed significantly as time went on. Late 18th century inquirers emphasized what they called dissecting circumstances, observing closely and carefully and recording everything. So all the little details that they observed that could potentially be relevant. Note that replication wasn't an issue for them, but repeating their own experiments was a must. In the mid-19th century, by contrast, the emphasis shifted. Inquirers now demanded training and practice control by experts, explicitly so, and control experiments. Next slide, please. In late 18th century contexts of investigation, methodological ideals were not strictly enforced. In the mid-19th century, by contrast, methodological statements became a means for exclusion. Fellow researchers were criticized for not having followed proper procedures, and the results were called into question for that reason. Hindsight shows that in the case of blue milk, methodological tolerance proved beneficial. Journals and magazines published and investigators discussed multiple short reports and quick trials that were deficient by the standards of the time. So not only in hindsight, but by the standards of the time, what people thought was a good experiment in the 18th century was just not what some of these quick trials were doing. Nevertheless, they were accepted and they were published. As researchers accepted the evidence from farmers and practitioners without formal academic training, it became clear that the problem of blue milk was widespread, appeared in various different environments, and was extremely difficult to treat. Solutions to the problem of the truly novel emerged from the works of better-known researchers and from the modest reports by unknown farmers and country doctors who sent little notes describing observations in small trials to farmers' magazines. Together, these contributions unearthed multiple potential causes and conditions for blue milk that were then subsequently tested. Next slide. Finally, there were quite profound changes in the views about who could offer credible evidence. Thank you. At first, contributions from almost all practitioners were welcome, except those who were arguing witchcraft. Later in the 19th century, only the properly academically trained could weigh in. Moreover, explicit discussions about methodological strategies and who had and had not applied them became a mark of authority. Tracing these historical developments and paying attention to past actors' concepts of ideals, so how they described what they were doing and where they put the emphasis in methodological strategies and how they thought what a good experiment and a good experimental practice was. If we're paying attention to that, I think we can, this helps us clarify those fuzzy concepts that were mentioned yesterday in the discussion. It helps uncover some of the tacit, taken for granted assumptions in our own thoughts about evidence, experts, and the power of scientific methodologies. Thank you very much.
Thank you, all three of you, for these presentations. I've learned a great deal from both the more extended papers and then your comments. I think that you've made clear the stakes of these investigations of the past and their lasting questions about which stories we believe, who we believe, how medical interventions are constructed to uphold things that are wrong, and why modern science values evidence the way that it does. I want to just pose a few very quick questions for each of you just to start out the discussion and then move to questions that the audience has raised. Gordon, I wondered if you'd looked at or thought about some more intergeneric comparisons among different kinds of narratives. I'd especially wonder about comparisons between consumption of novels and of either science or religion. Religion comes up very briefly, but I really do wonder about the science and going to the kinds of accounts that Jutta was talking about, many of which are constructed as narratives in which an observer tells a story. And then Bible stories were also narratives. So can you deduce anything about the preference or difference in comprehension among these different written sources? If I could leave that question with you and move to something that I wanted to pose about Elise's wonderful paper. This is a beyond timely examination of the history of isolation of the sick. Also a warning, as we all hope for a COVID-19 vaccine, that having a specific way to prevent an illness, in this case inoculation against smallpox, it may not solve every problem, obviously. If I could focus on your statement in the written paper, that the originally Italian practice of quarantining for plague was adopted for Iberian use against smallpox in New World territories. And I was just curious to fill in the small gap. Was quarantining against smallpox also used within Spain itself? So had the modification already occurred there? Was there something distinctively New World about this adaptation? So anything that you would have to say about that, I would be very interested to know. And then finally, and quickly, Jutta, I appreciated this investigation both as a historian of science and as a historian of food as well. And it's in terms of food history that I actually have a question. Your analysis, which was necessarily pared down, doesn't go into the context really of milk production and even of just scientific analysis of milk itself, aside from the question of whether it's blue or not. So my question is about the understanding of milk in these two different periods. You emphasize the changes in science during these two different periods as if the milk itself has a kind of stability, and that's what I wondered about. What might have changed about milk over time in terms of how and where it was produced, how far from consumers or investigators it was produced? Was it more or less available to people? Was it thought to be healthy or not? So what I'm asking is about whether the idea and reality of milk also might have changed along with the science. So I just hope that those are some questions to get us started. I don't know whether, before we move to questions from people watching, whether any of the three of you wanted to say anything at this point.
Sure, I can get started. The question about genres and the different types of narratives that are being read, I think, is an interesting one, because when this project started, I imagined that it was really just about novels. And what I came to realize is that conversations about reading were getting sidelined by this obsession that people in the early Republic had about women reading novels. And so someone who appreciates biography or narrative in the form of biography or in the form of history suddenly has a hang up about people reading Susanna Rosen's novels about women and women reading novels. And so that was kind of sidelining the conversation that they were otherwise having about reading. And so when I think about the different genres, I'll just give an example. The Brentwood, New Hampshire Social Library was founded in, I think, 1803 or 1807 by a congregational minister named Ebenezer Flint. And he, in his inaugural sermon, imagines that that the community will be protected from tyranny by reading and education that will keep them on the right path. And he founds this library with other kind of notables from the community. And they only select, I think, initially 40 books. And the genres they choose are novels, histories, political histories, one book of natural history, a kind of multi-volume book of natural history, and then several biographies. And that's his kind of vision for the community, that they will read these books and produce a kind of culture of reading that protects them politically and spiritually. And he's writing at a moment when he's not sure how long the United States will last and things like that. So he's imagining this kind of future. The natural history, and I'm having one of those moments where the title of the book escapes me, was heavily illustrated, and it was the most popular. It was the most popular text that was withdrawn. People would withdraw it a volume at a time, but it had these beautiful engravings. And then the other histories and novels were the next most popular. And biographies grew steadily over time, but initially were not.
Thank you.
I'm happy to answer the question regarding quarantine. So yes, there were quarantines used in Spain, particularly in Seville in the 16th century, as well as in Portugal. So both Spain and Portugal in the early 16th century, and I'm and I'm sorry, it's been quite a week, so I'm blanking on the unification and history of the crowns, but they passed a series of public health reforms in the early 16th century. And in Portugal, because Portugal was one of the leading areas shipping enslaved people to the Americas via places like Lisbon, some of their public health reforms specifically targeted the slave trade once they were coming to the Americas. So there was a variety of quarantine policies, as well as the establishment of pest houses and other public health reforms. Lorinda Abreu's scholarship is very good on this. And also there's a history of the slave trade through Portugal in the early 16th century. And I believe, last name Saunders, I'm sorry, the scholar's first name is escaping me. And for the history of quarantines in Seville, Catherine Wilson Bowers would be the right person to look at for that. In the Americas, in terms of when they start quarantining enslaved people or using maritime quarantine for goods, I've seen some records describing something that sounds like quarantine, but not explicitly calling it that, as early as like the 1520s in the wake of a really bad smallpox outbreak, reputedly the first smallpox outbreak in the Americas. And then after that, there's a consistent concern, like a lot of folks involved in the slave trade consistently are concerned about smallpox in particular, as well as measles and a few other contagious diseases. And then by the turn of the 17th century, the slave trade shifts to West Central Africa, and you start to see a lot more children in the trade as a result of like the structure of the slave trade out of West Central Africa into the Caribbean. And that's when you start to see a number of Spanish American municipalities passing very explicit quarantine laws that specifically target slave ships. So while a lot of historians that I've spoken to about the history of maritime quarantine ask about the difference between the practice of maritime quarantine for goods or the slave trade, aren't they kind of the same thing? The fact that there's a distinct legal tradition going back to the early 17th century makes me think that it's kind of worthy of a category of its own. And it's this legal tradition that influences later the French as well as British quarantine policies that specifically target slave ships, and often with the explicit purpose saying that they're designed to protect families and children within the colonies. So these policies were not, and I say this pretty clearly in the paper, these policies were not designed to improve enslaved people's health or prevent the disease amongst them so much as they were to prevent colonial residents from contracting the disease. And oftentimes these policies get passed at times when the different colonies, whether it's French, Spanish, British, or Portuguese, have a real concern around the reproduction of family structures. Like there's one really telling example from Jamaica, 1732. I mentioned the law at the end of the paper, but I don't go into this, where there wasn't a real concern in that period around the demographic superiority of Black folks in the islands, and they wanted to expand the British settlements into the hinterlands, which caused the Maroon War. At the same time, they also passed a quarantine law that explicitly says we're concerned about the smallpox affecting white children and families because they're essential to this wider settlement project. So this history of public health and the way that it intersects with the history of the slave trade is actually really important also for understanding how empires are built and maintained. And I think also has bearing in terms of like what kind of public health traditions we see in our society today. Thank you.
Thanks. Jutta, did you?
Yeah, let me start with a comment on the narrative, if I may, because Joyce, you said that the investigators tell stories, and that is actually something that could also be unpacked in the sense that they are telling different kinds of stories. And I think this is a really interesting thing to look at, how that also changed from the 18th to the 20th century. I mean, the 20th century is the time when we start seeing the structured scientific papers as we now know and love them. But during the 18th and 19th century, we have this narrative structure, but the narrative is constructed in different ways. So, for example, the question of, do we emphasize the discussion about scientific methods and who does what properly and did they do things properly? That is sometimes it's foregrounded and sometimes it stays in the background and just results are reported. So there are some issues that I think could also be discussed in more detail. The other question about the milk, I think this is really not in my focus, so I don't have a lot to say on that. But my impression is that the big change in the way in which milk was produced and reached the consumer was really in the early 20th century, because it was then that the milk became more removed from the consumer, and that also all kinds of hygiene and sanitation measures were introduced with the industrial milk production. However, what I think is important for the period that I've looked at, well, several other things, but one particular important one is the status of the public health officer. Because my impression now, and I would need to do more research on that, is that in the late 18th century, that was a person who was called in when things were wrong. So, you know, you have this problem and you call in an expert who is not necessarily medically trained or academically trained, well, academically trained, but not necessarily in medical research, in, you know, maybe in law or in administration. And that person is expected to deal with the problem. Whereas later on, this is becomes a preventative method and measure, that you make sure that things are in the proper state to begin with, and that the problems don't even arise.
Well, wonderful. And we do have a wealth of questions coming in. We can certainly continue the session until about 10 or 15 minutes past the hour. I'm gathering up questions as they arrive, and a very interesting one, I think inspired by just the opening paper about what narrative does, when it is credible, how it leads us to imagine other people who are telling things that are not entirely factual. And so a question inspired by that, mostly for Elise, but I think everyone could respond to it. What is the role of speculation, which Elise you did invoke to say that this is necessary? I would suspect you would want to differentiate between the kind of speculation that a novelist would do versus the kind of speculation that a historian might do, but perhaps not. So Elise, if we could ask you to begin with this question, but I would love to hear the other panelists' thoughts about that.
Sure. Gosh, this is a question that historians of enslaved people versus historians of slavery get asked often. And it's a good question, it's an important one. So within my field, as someone who studies the history of enslaved people, we have an at least 92-year tradition, if we go back to C.L.R. James, the Black Jacobins, of historians speculating about what enslaved people thought or experienced at different times in order to fill out some of the gaps in the archive, and also challenge certain archival narratives that represent enslaved people as either docile or as thoughtless or as bereft of culture or intellectual production. And so sort of by reading across different archives, we can find a pretty dense evidentiary basis from which to speculate on, which I think is somewhat different from what some novelists do. There are some novelists who I think do very, very detailed archival research to create and reinvent different kinds of stories. But again, the difference between a novelist and a historian, I think one of the things that you might notice in the paper is how often I expose the fact that I'm speculating, and also expose the evidentiary basis upon which I'm speculating. And one of the things that I think might link into another question that I saw around the difference between quantitative versus qualitative accounts. My trouble there, and maybe I wasn't clear in the paper or in my presentation, is not necessarily the nature of the account itself, although there are critiques to be made there, but the kinds of sources that we use. So for the slave trade, particularly for using this voyage as an example, there are a number of financial records and records describing slave mortality about this voyage in the British and Spanish record. And then there are also testimonies, because everyone involved with the voyage was deposed before the Cabildo of Caracas, and also a pretty large body of correspondence about the voyage amongst the South Sea Company agents. And so by using those records, you're able to then sort of speculate and link together a history that attends to what these enslaved people may have experienced, versus using the purely qualitative and financial records, which provide you with a lot of numbers that are not necessarily, that don't necessarily correspond with what the qualitative accounts provide. So I think that that speaks to the question. I'd like to hear what other folks have to say.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, this could get a little metalogical for you, Gordon, but go ahead in terms of what evidence and speculation mean in terms of being a scholar.
Well, I'd just like to echo what Elise said, in some sense, because the materials I'm looking at, I'm really dealing with a theory of investigating the world that presupposes that there will not be enough fact, and facts will not speak for themselves. And so, if I think about how do I know someone's motivations, I have a lot of evidence about what they've done and said, and perhaps I have some evidence about what they've done and said with other people. But really, I need to kind of train myself to be a reader of other people's character and motivations, which requires me to either have access to their internal monologue, which I don't have, or to become the kind of reader of texts and people who can connect dots and put things together. And it seems to me that the problem that various people in the 18th century are trying to solve is the same problem that we have with archival erasures as we write history. That when I think about a novel like Toni Morrison's A Mercy, which is essentially trying to surface a history that's been erased because there isn't enough material evidence to get access to those lives, what we end up with is through her novel, we end up with a kind of narrative of people's lives that surfaces things we would otherwise not be able to access. And so to me, that's what's at stake when we think about narrative's relationship to fact and evidence. It's stories like that are really at stake. Like what do they do, and how do they do that work?
Jutta, I don't know whether you wanted to add something at this point, or?
Yeah, I mean, I think with regard to history of science, it really depends on what we want to know. And I mean, we are acutely aware that what we find in the publications is not what really happens, say, in a lab, or when people are actually pursuing an investigation in the field or what have you. So, but there are some ways of trying to recover this. There are, for example, instruments that we still have from the 17th, 18th, 19th century that we can even try to use and try to replicate experiments, and from that practice gather some insights. Of course, it's not the same thing, but at least it gives us an idea of what kinds of skills, for example, are necessary to do these kinds of experiments. Could they even be done? Or did somebody report something that was never done and was just imagined? Yeah, I think that's leave it at that. So, but that, of course, is a big problem for recovering discovery practices.
Now, the question of instruments and the materiality of experience is a very interesting dimension within this, I think. If I could bundle up a couple of questions that people had, or two questions that people had for Gordon next. There's a question about how people learned to read in this way, to be the text as a kind of skeptical view into other people. And if I can combine that with a question raised about gender, who was doing different kinds of reading, where do we see responses to certain kinds of authors? How does gender play into this story?
Yeah, I think yeah, I saw those questions. I think they're great questions because in some ways, one of my frustrations with some of the psychological research around reading and reading fiction is that it presupposes a naturalistic relationship to reading fiction, right? I pick up this book and it presupposes that something kind of naturally happens, which is not the case at all, that there are cultures of reading. Do I read aloud, or do I read silently? Do I read with others? What am I supposed to learn from my reading? And all of these things are kind of culturally embedded and culturally produced. and they're highly gendered. So, so I'll give two quick examples. So one of the reasons I called that first theory the John Adams theory isn't because he wrote extensively about reading, but he did write about his expectations for his son, John Quincy, and what John Quincy would get out of reading novels and what John Quincy would get out of reading biography. And he also, in his own writing, oftentimes modeled his descriptions of other people on descriptions in novels. And one of the things that that does is it produces a culture in which, or kind of reading culture, in which these men are traveling the world, encountering people, and they're learning to read character and motivation the way a reader of novels reads character and motivation. And that's a form of socialization. It's not, I could read the same novel and come to very different conclusions, but it's a highly gendered, because he imagines John Quincy will go on to be a leader of men. And it's shaped by this relation to novels. If I think about Elizabeth Phillips Payson, she's having a very different experience, but she's also becoming quite a canny reader. So her commonplace book doesn't follow the standard practice of merely writing out quotations, which was longstanding. She writes these long reflections. She begins it in the early 19th century. A few years later, she joins a reading group of women, a kind of a precursor to the conversations Margaret Fuller would later have. And it's a group of women in her social class, in her community, and they read histories and novels together, and they communicate, and she notes what other members of the group said. And then the group falls apart, and she continues to read and reflect on writing. And that's a very different culture. I think there's a kind of canniness in both. If you read Adams on novels and if you read Elizabeth Phillips Payson on novels, they're both quite canny and skeptical readers of people and readers of character. But they're coming to that from highly gendered and very different kind of cultures of reading, it seems to me.
Thank you. And if I could, again, bundle up a pair of questions for Jutta. One was a question about when do big changes in methodological strategies tend to occur? Kind of a Thomas Kuhn question, perhaps, or you may want to push back against that framing of it. But when are the big shifts? What do they correlate with? What seems to cause them? And perhaps relatedly, are novel problems distinctively productive of this? New phenomena, new attention to phenomena that perhaps have belonged to one hidden community, but now have been brought to greater attention. So the question of the big shifts and the issue of novelty in definitions of problems in science.
Yeah, that is exactly well, one of the big issues that I'm grappling with myself, the question of what does it even mean to have novel methodologies? And I mean, I started out thinking that there are a lot, there's a lot of innovation in terms of, there's a lot of new things in terms of methodologies. But when I started thinking that through, it occurred to me that many of the things that we think of as new are actually logistic improvements. So when we have a new technology, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a new approach to experimentation. It just maybe means that we have a better way to control things. So the way I'm thinking now about what has been called the laboratory revolution in the 19th century, these big academic labs that some people think make a whole new way of doing science. But when we look at how experimental strategy is, how experimentation is approached in terms of how the practitioners try to grapple with causation and finding out cause-effects relationships and these kinds of things, there's a big continuity there. The lab allows us to do this in a more controlled way, but it is not, I would not say it's a methodological innovation. And so methodological innovations, examples for that, I think, are randomization, for example, or yesterday statistical significance testing was mentioned. I suppose that could count as an innovation, but I'm still thinking about what really is the difference between an improvement and an innovation? I can't answer your question, I'm afraid.
Still, yeah. No, because it remains. And here, if I could proceed to a question I think everyone could possibly discuss moving forward from Jutta's comments here. How do we differentiate fact from fiction? I mean, which is present in all of your papers in different ways. We know this, we don't know that. This is fiction, this is a novel, and this is not a novel. So disciplinarily, and then from the perspective of your own research, if you could say a little bit about the criteria by which you think either historically, intellectually, that differentiation has meaning.
I can start. In some ways, I threw up my hands trying to make this to distinguish between fact and fiction when I first started looking at what people were reading. In part because what I found is that people would read a novel, say The Coquette, which Elizabeth Payson Phillips read, and they would. The novel would say that it's founded on facts, and she was quite credulous when she read it, and she said, this is a novel founded literally of facts. And then she tried to put names to the character names. So she assumed that the names had been changed to protect people, but that they were real people and they could be discovered. And she attempted to discover who they were. And this led her down some blind alleys. She gets some things wrong about the factual story because she assumes that the novel is being true. I also found in records, in library records at the New York Society Library, readers were checking out supposedly factual accounts of the Illuminati conspiracy, which I make reference to, this conspiracy about enslaved Black men and French soldiers. They were checking out ostensibly factual accounts of that conspiracy alongside novels that depicted elements of that conspiracy, like Charles Brockden Brown's Ormond or Sally Wood's Julia and the Illuminated Baron. And so it seems to me that the line, which I have very clear in my mind, this is a novel, this is a work of nonfiction, is not nearly as clear or as stark as I would have it.
I've received a prompt that we might want to wrap things up. I want to reiterate my thanks to Adriana, Kyle, and the APS, and to these three amazing presenters of ongoing research, Jutta, Gordon, and Elise. And I just want to draw attention, as one of our questioners did as well, to Elise's wonderful phrase, what we do and do not know, which I think is a really, really great meditation for what, as scholars of the past and of individuals in the past, we are trying to accomplish. So my thanks. I don't know whether this means Kyle comes in. Oh, Adriana is urging me to urge you all to join tomorrow for the continuing events. Sorry, Thursday, she is saying. I'm reading on my screen. So I, again, thank the panelists especially.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.